Miss anybody? Need a handout? I've still got a few left up here. You'll have to forgive me for this. I taught Bible at a Christian school for 5 years, and old habits die hard. If it helps, just think of this as my PowerPoint on paper. So, all right. Thursday mid-morning, I was sitting at my desk trying to find motivation to go out and work in the lawn. And David Perry called and asked if I could cover the class. You have to forgive me, I'm not sure who your teacher is, but he's out of town today. And so David called and said that I could do whatever I wanted in Luke chapter 11 and 12. And I told him I'd be thrilled to do it, partly because I love teaching Bible class, and partly because I now have an excuse not to go work in the lawn. And the best part is I was able to milk that excuse for 2 full days. Now, you don't have to tell my wife that last part, but it's possible she's in here and listening to me, so she may already know. I know she's in here, I just can't guarantee she's listening to me. All right, let's start in Luke chapter 10. We're actually going to start, I've just picked out a couple of things, the story of the Good Samaritan, and then the Lord's Prayer in chapter 11. If we have time, we'll have a little fun with language games here at the end of it. But before you get to verse 25 in chapter 10, I want you to look at one thing real quick in Luke chapter 10 and verse 2. Jesus is sending out the 72, and he says to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And I got to thinking, churches I've been at, and myself, when we see a need of any kind, what do? Well, we put together a committee, and we develop a 27-step plan, complete with PowerPoint, to recruit, train, and deploy the laborers for the harvest. And I'm not saying that that's bad or wrong, okay? There's nothing at all wrong with recruiting and training people to meet a need. But that's not what Jesus said to do, is it? He said, pray to the Father to send laborers. And I wonder, I haven't been in Fort Gibson long enough, so this is not any kind of comment on the church here, okay? But I wonder if our first instinct isn't get to work when it ought to be get on your knees. There's nothing wrong with preparing and planning, but if it's not accompanied first by prayer, I think we're going about it the wrong way. So that part's free. Let's move on down to verse 25. The Good Samaritan. A lawyer stood up to put him, Jesus, to the test. Now, this lawyer, he would be an expert in Jewish law and traditions attached to the law. According to the rabbis, there are 613 commandments in the Old Testament. This lawyer would have known every one of them, backward, forward, inside out, and upside down. And he would have known how through the centuries the rabbis had interpreted those commandments and applied them in different ways. We'll talk about one of those here in a little bit. So in other words, folks, he knows the book. He knows it real well. And he stands up and he asks Jesus, "What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, in the Middle Ages, theologians debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. I've never understood why that was important to know, but I do know it's something that they spent a whole lot of time arguing about. Well, the question that the lawyer asked Jesus here is actually a very common question among Jewish theologians of that time. What do you got to do to earn your place with God? Now, and notice I said earn because that's how they viewed it. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus answers him in a typical rabbi way. How do you read? The rabbis would always turn the question back to the questioner, make the questioner state his case, at which point the rabbi could say, "Well, you're wrong and here's why." Or he could say, "You're right, go do it." So Jesus turns the question back on the lawyer, probably as the lawyer pretty much expected, and the lawyer gives this answer: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. In Mark chapter 12, when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, do you remember his answer? It's almost word for word what the lawyer said, isn't it? So I'd have to say that the lawyer gave a good answer. And Jesus affirmed it. He says, "You're right. You've answered correctly. Go do this and live." Well, now we have a problem. Because neighbor could be defined a whole lot of ways, couldn't it? Could be the people who literally live next door to me, in which case I don't really have a whole lot to do. It could be the people in my hometown, people who are like me, which would still sort of limit my exposure But what if neighbor is a really broad term? All of a sudden, my responsibility just got huge. So the lawyer asks, well then, who is my neighbor? He's seeking to limit the principle that he stated. Love God, love your neighbor, that's the principle. Well, now he's trying to put limits on that to limit his responsibility and his exposure. Jewish teachers taught that neighbor meant fellow Israelite and nobody else. In fact, when they discussed the Sabbath command, don't work on the Sabbath day, in that discussion, you can eventually find, what do you do if a wall falls on the Sabbath day and traps people underneath it? The rabbis taught you can excavate the rubble just long enough to find out if it's a Jew or a Gentile. If it's a Jew, it's okay to break the Sabbath law because the greater law is to love your neighbor as yourself, and that Jew, that Israelite, is your neighbor. If it's a Gentile, the Sabbath law says don't work on the Sabbath. The Gentile is not your neighbor, so you just leave him until the Sabbath is over. Now that's the kind of thing the lawyer would have known. And that's why he's asking Jesus, who's my neighbor? What are the limits here? Can we narrow this down like the rabbis have always taught that we ought to? Now what's interesting, the verse is quoted, love your neighbor as yourself. That's that's Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And in the immediate context of that verse, it's talking about Israelites. It talks about the sons of your people and love your neighbor as yourself. It only means Israel. However, if you go down 16 more verses, Leviticus 19, verse 34, the law says that when you have a stranger in the land, in other words, a non-Israelite, you show kindness and love to him because you were once strangers in a foreign land, and you shall love him as yourself. So the Old Testament actually applies that love your neighbors yourself to both Israelites and everyone. So you can kind of see where the lawyer's coming from, can't you? He's trying to, well, which one counts? So who's my neighbor? As Jesus often did, he didn't answer the question. He told the story, told the parable. So you got a fellow going down to Jericho. Now, just for what it's worth, Jericho is lower in elevation than Jerusalem is. That's why you went down to Jericho. When we look at a map, up means north, right? And down means south. We don't care about height or elevation. That's not the way the Israelites thought, or that's not the way the Jews reckoned it. It was always had to do with relative elevation. And for what it's worth, anytime in the Bible you see a reference to up and down, an elevation like that, it's always right. Every time, it's right. Anyway, you're going down. This fellow's going down to Jerusalem. It's a steep 17 to 18-mile journey. The road is serpentine, weaving, cutting back and forth. There are switchbacks. There are caves along the sides. It is the ideal place for a bad guy to hide and ambush someone. And for centuries, it was known you don't travel the Jericho Road by yourself. If you're traveling by yourself, what happened to this guy is going to happen to you. It's just guaranteed. It's going to happen. You would go in a large group because there's enough of you, the bandits will just wait for somebody who's not quite as prepared and attack them. But this fella, for whatever reason, is traveling alone. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, up until the 5th century, the Jericho Road was known as the Red Way. Want to guess what the red stood for? Blood. Because you took your life in your hands when you went down the Jericho Road. Up till the 19th century, if you wanted to make it safely, you had to pay protection money to a local sheik, or you wouldn't get to Jericho in one piece. So this fellow's traveling by himself, which was kind of a foolish thing to do, and the obvious thing happened. He was attacked, he was beaten, he was robbed, they stripped him of his clothes, they left him for dead. Now you may be wondering why they took his clothes. In that day, most people only owned one change of clothes. So whoever took his clothes now had 2 changes, which could be valuable to him or valuable to sell. I mean, you're not going to get much out of what I'm wearing if you were to take it and try to sell it. But in that day, it would have brought a pretty good price. So they didn't just take the money he was carrying or the stuff that he was carrying. They took his clothes too, beat him up, and left him for dead. And of course, there's some traffic on the Jericho Road, and other people begin to come by. The first is a priest. Now, in the New Testament time, there were so many priests that most of them did not live in Jerusalem. They lived somewhere out in the land, and they actually worked at the temple in shifts. Depending on when you were born and when your lot came around, it's possible that some priests only served at the temple one day in their lives. There were just so many of them at that point. So, you see the priest, and he's going from Jericho to Jerusalem. He probably lives in Jericho, and something's going on at the temple in Jerusalem, and that's why he's going there. Well, if he was going to Jerusalem, you can kind of understand why he'd be hesitant to get involved, because priests were anybody that touched a dead body would be ritually impure for a period of time. You can't be around other people, and you certainly cannot enter the temple if you're ritually impure. So if the priest was on his way to Jerusalem to do his service, you can kind of understand why he wouldn't want to get involved with what looks like a dead body, because he becomes ritually impure, then he can't serve at the temple, and everything goes bad. But did you notice it says he's going down the road? He's not going to Jerusalem, is he? He's already been and done his thing. Now, being ritually impure would be a massive inconvenience for him, but it wouldn't ruin his service to God. He's got no valid excuse. But he sees the fella, left for dead, looks like he's dead, and he just chooses not to get involved. Passes by on the other side. You want to know why he passed on the other side? The Pharisees taught that if even your shadow touched a dead body, you would become ritually unclean. So he passes by on the other side, refuses to get involved. A little later, a Levite passes by. And the Levites were the worker bees of the temple. And just like priests, there were thousands and thousands of them by this time in Israel's history. Likely this fellow did not serve at the temple permanently, especially since he was traveling away from Jerusalem. The restrictions for him were not as severe as they were for a priest, but still, becoming ritually impure was a massive inconvenience. You couldn't stay with your family, and most homes you wouldn't have a spare room where he could stay for the period of his uncleanness. He likely would have to move to a cave, on the edge of town and live there until the uncleanness was over. And his wife would have to have two sets of pots and pans, one to serve him unclean and one to serve the rest of the family. Just more trouble than you can possibly imagine. He doesn't want to get involved, so he passes on the other side of the road. And then the third traveler comes by, and he's a Samaritan. Now, in later years, when the rabbis would tell stories, it was rather common to have a pious Israelite who would show up a priest or a Levite. But in this case, it's not an Israelite who shows him up. Who is it? It's a Samaritan. And there is nothing that would have shocked Jesus' audience more than that. Now, who are the Samaritans? Real quick is Israelite history. David and Solomon have a kingdom, right? Solomon dies, his son takes over, his son's a jerk, and the kingdom gets ripped in half. 10 tribes go to the north, and they call themselves Israel. 2 tribes stay in the south, and they call themselves Judah. Okay, that's roughly around the year 930, between 900 and 930 BC. In 721 BC, the nation of Assyria attacked the northern kingdom and conquered it. And when the Assyrians conquered someone, they would take the bulk of the population, haul them off, and drop them in another part of their empire. They didn't make slaves out of them. They just dumped them in a strange land, the thought being that you'd be so busy trying to figure out where you are, what you're going to do, make a living, just try to survive, you wouldn't have time to mount a rebellion. So most of the Israelites from the north got hauled off somewhere and dumped in the Assyrian kingdom, and we have no idea what happened to them from then. They literally disappeared from history. There were a few Israelites left in the Holy Land, though, and they would have been the lower classes, the dregs of society. And so the Israelites brought people from somewhere else in their empire and dumped them in Israel. And after a period of time, they began to intermarry with the leftover Israelites, and that becomes the Samaritans. Now, if you remember the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they came back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and the temple and so on, those, pardon me for the expression, but those half-breed locals wanted to help. And what did the purebred Israelites tell them? Take a hike. We don't want you anywhere near this. Because the law says you're not supposed to intermarry with other nations. And that's what these remnant Israelites had done. Well, these early Samaritans didn't take that too well, so they went back to their home and they developed their own aberrant version of Judaism. They accepted only the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. They didn't take the historical books, the prophets or anything, only the books of Moses. And their version of the Pentateuch said the temple was to be built on Mount Gerizim. conveniently located in their territory. And they built a temple on Gerizim, and they offered sacrifices and performed all the rituals of the law of Moses there on Gerizim instead of in Jerusalem. So, as you might expect, Jews despised Samaritans. They wouldn't eat with them, wouldn't associate with them, wouldn't talk with them unless they were forced to. Just an extreme amount of avoidance. And, when you think about it, you can kind of understand what's going on. It's partly a family feud, right? Because they are related. And you ask any policeman, the worst kind of call is a domestic call involving a family squabble. There's nothing like a family fight. But beyond that, the Jews viewed the Samaritans as heretics. They had the law. They were supposed to know the law. And if they hadn't corrupted the book, they'd be doing the right things in the right place. That's how the Jews looked at it. So they didn't like them. Guess what, though? Samaritans also despised Jews. They thought they were arrogant, self-righteous bullies. And they thought the Jews were heretics because the Samaritan version of the book said what? Worship on Mount Gerizim, and here are the Jews off worshiping in Jerusalem. See, both sides thought the other was religiously wrong. And when you're supposed to kind of be in agreement, but you aren't religiously, that word heretic comes in, and boy, do things get nasty at that point, don't they? If you know anything about modern Islam, you know that there are two basic versions, Sunni and Shia. They're all Muslims. They all follow the Quran. They all view Muhammad as a prophet. But boy, do they not get along. Because even though they're religiously related, they have some serious differences, and both sides are convinced the other is dead wrong. Both sides convinced the other are committing heresy. And that's why you've got some of the difficulties in the Muslim world because of the Sunni and Shia. Well, that's kind of what you got going on here. Jews and Samaritans. And as you might expect, there would occasionally be violence between the two sides. Any of y'all heard of the Maccabees? You know who they are? 100s, 200s, they led the Israelites, or led the Jews to independence from, at that point, a Greek kingdom. And they ruled an independent nation of Israel until the Romans conquered them. Well, in 128 BC, one of their kings, John Hyrcanus, decided to attack the Samaritans. He captured the city of Shechem, their main city, and he destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim, which you can imagine did not go over well with the Samaritans. Somewhere between the years AD 6 and 9, in other words, when Jesus was a little boy, the Samaritans defiled the Jerusalem temple by scattering the bones of dead creatures around the temple precinct during Passover. Now, doing it any time would be a huge insult. But doing it during Passover? That's the foundation feast of the Israelites. That remembers God saving them from Egypt and leading them into the promised land, and everything that made them a nation, everything that made them who they are, that all gets wrapped up in Passover. And here the Samaritans defile Passover by scattering the bones of dead animals, dead people, whatever it was, in the temple precincts during Passover. In AD 51, Samaritans massacred a group of Jewish pilgrims heading from Galilee down to Jerusalem, which led to reprisal raids by the Jews. We have no idea how many people actually died. So, when Jesus has the next character be a Samaritan, that's shocking. For the Samaritan to wind up being the hero of the story is just beyond comprehension. And yet that's what happens. He wanders along. Oh, by the way, remember, it's not just that Jews despise Samaritans, but no Samaritan would ever show compassion for a Jew because they despise Jews. But not this one. He walks along, he sees the man, and a human being in need trumped all of the cultural, religious considerations, roadblocks, everything that might have existed. So he cleans everything up with oil, which is common medical practice, and the wine was probably meant to disinfect in some way, and then he binds up his wounds. Now, think about this. Unless he was a cloth merchant, what did he use to bind up the wounds? His own clothing. And then he can't ride the donkey anymore because the wounded man is on it. He actually takes the position, the physical position of a servant or slave, and guides the donkey to the inn. Now, inns were known for immorality and innkeepers were known to be dishonest. So he gets the fellow there and gets him set up in a room and says, listen, I'll pay you for a couple of weeks, and if there's anything else, I will repay. That phrase, I will repay, that's the standard formula for guaranteeing a debt. I mean, when you say that, you have legitimately put yourself on the hook. And in doing so, he guarantees that the wounded man will receive care because now the innkeeper's got financial incentive. It's not like the Samaritan's going to be able to audit, and figure out exactly if the fellow says, I spent another $1,000 on him, he's on the hook for it. Because there's no way he knows what was provided. So his promise, I will repay, is actually pretty broad. And so Jesus finishes the story, and he looks at the lawyer and he says, all right, which one proved to be a neighbor? And notice the lawyer can't bring himself to say the Samaritan. He's got to make it third, fourth person or whatever. Well, it's the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, you're right. You go and do likewise. So what's he said? You stop asking, who's my neighbor? And you start asking, to whom can I be a neighbor? Your responsibility doesn't depend on who they are. It depends on who you are. You're a child of God. You're called to be God-like. What does God do? Rob was talking about it. Grace on the good and the bad alike, right? You have the opportunity to help, you help. Period. End of story. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter how good or bad they are. Doesn't matter what they're in the middle of doing. They need help, and you can help, you help. It's not who they are, who you are. All right, let's move down chapter 11 and what we call the Lord's Prayer. It begins with the word Father. And when Jews prayed, their most common form of address was Lord of the universe. If they used the word Father, they would add an adjective to it, exalted Father, Heavenly Father, something to distance God from man. And I want you to notice the absence of an adjective here. It's simply Father. Later on, the Jews didn't practice intimacy of any kind in their relationship with God, but Jesus did. Later on in the book of Mark, chapter 14, when he's praying in the garden, what does he use for Father? Abba. In Romans chapter 8, verse 15, Paul tells us that word now belongs to us, that we can call God Abba. Well, what's Abba? It's the first word, one of the first words that a small child in the Middle East will learn to say. Now, almost all of us here have children, right? And you remember when they were learning to talk, and you were encouraging them what to say, right? Mama, Dada, and it was kind of a big competition to see which one they were going to say first. Well, in the Middle East, I don't know what the word for mama is, but the word for dada is Abba. And so you've got fathers all over the Middle East looking at their little baby saying, say Abba, say Abba. I had a professor that told about being in a market, an outdoor market in Israel, and a little Arab child had gotten separated from her father. And when she realized she was alone, what'd she do? She started screaming, Abba! Abba! Of course, he wasn't very far away, and he came running and picked her up, and everything was fine. But that's the word, the relationship that Jesus starts the prayer with is a word that implies dependence, trust, and love. So, Father, hallowed be your name and your kingdom come. The Jewish daily prayer said, exalted and hallowed be your name, and may your kingdom come speedily and soon. You hallow God's name by living right. When you live wrong, you profane his name. Amos chapter 2, verse 7, it talks about a man and his father going into the same girl, thus profaning my name. Evil, sin profanes the name of God. You hallow God's name by living right. It's kind of why in Matthew's version of this prayer, it includes the phrase, your will be done. No, you live right. What we're praying here is, when we're praying, hallowed be your name, what we're saying is, may we live in such a way that brings praise to your name and does not profane your name. Then give us each day our daily bread. This harkens back to the giving of manna in Exodus chapter 16. You remember that? The Israelites are wandering in the desert, they don't have enough food, and God says he'll provide, and they wake up and there's this white stuff all over the ground. And I think this is interesting, but I like language stuff. The Hebrews look at it, and they say, manhu, which in Hebrew means, what's that stuff? And so manhu becomes manna, so they named it, what's that stuff? So, and every morning God would provide the what's that stuff. And every family was to collect 1 omer, half a bushel thereabouts. And it didn't matter how big your family was, you had enough. But if you collected more than an omer, do you remember what happened? It rotted. The next morning it spoiled, filled with worms, and nasty as all get out. You only collected each day enough for that day. Now, see, Israel's, when they came out of Egypt, their problem was they didn't know how to depend on God. That's why they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. He tried to lead them in the Holy Land early, and they didn't trust him enough and decided to go back. And he said, okay, fine, we're going to spend some time you learning to trust me. You know one of the ways he taught them to trust? Bread. Every day, only if he provided. Did he provide? Yeah. So every day they got their bread. And so we pray, give us our daily bread. Also makes me think of Proverbs chapter 30, verse 8. Give me neither poverty or riches. I mean, I kind of like the way the NIV writes it. Only what I need for today. Don't give me so much that it spoils me. Only what I need for today. Then forgive us our sins. Now, in Jewish thought, sins were debts before God. In fact, the Aramaic, the common language of the time, you use the same word for sin and debt. The Aramaic doesn't have 2 words for sin and debt, it's 1 word. So when Jesus talked about forgiving debts, that made sense. By the way, that Aramaic word explains why in the first part of verse 4 here, it's forgive us our sins, but the latter part of verse 4, we forgive everyone who's indebted to us. Well, in Aramaic, sin and debt's the same word. So if God's forgiving our sins, we're forgiving their sins. If we're forgiving their debts, God's forgiving our debts. It's all the same thing. Now, I want to spend a limited bit of time talking about debts. And let me get in the weeds here of the law of Moses just a little bit, but there's a point, so stick with me here, okay? The law of Moses, in theory at least, required forgiveness of debts every 7 years. And every 50 years, all mortgages were canceled. Here's how it worked. Deuteronomy chapter 15, the first 10 verses, every 10 years, if I have loaned somebody money, that debt gets wiped out. And God, knowing human nature, actually specifies that you don't think like this. Daryl comes and asks me for a loan. And I start calculating, let's see, it's 6 years and 6 months. If that Yahoo doesn't pay me back in 6 months, I'm not going to get any of it. And the law specifically says you don't think like that. If he needs the money, you loan him the money. And if the 7 years wipes it out, then the 7 years wipes it out. So every 7 years, all debts are forgiven. Every 50 years, this is Leviticus chapter 25, you have what's called the law of Jubilee. When the Israelites took the promised land, the land was divided among the tribes, each tribe divided among the clans, and each clan divided among the families. And the thought was the land would stay in the family, clan, and tribe. You basically didn't sell property. That was frowned upon. Of course, if you got in bad enough financial shape, you might have to do it. But even then, you were supposed to sell it to somebody within the clan or within the family. That's the background of the book of Ruth, right? Her first husband's died. He's got property. He's probably got some debts. And whoever is first in line, the closest relative, if he pays off the debts, he gets the land. And he says, well, I'll be happy to do that. I'm happy to have more land. And then he finds out that Ruth is part of the package deal. And, well, no, he doesn't need another woman. So he declines. And guess who's second in line? Boaz, who doesn't care about the land. He wants Ruth. But he happily pays off the land, and then he gets the woman he loves as well. So, but every 50 years, all mortgages are canceled, and the land reverts to the original owner. In fact, when you sold property, you did not sell the property. You sold the number of crops between now and Jubilee. So if it's 5 years till Jubilee, then I'll sell you my land for 5 years of crops. If it's 23 years till Jubilee, then it's going to cost more, isn't it? Because there's 23 years of crops to come. The law says that in between Jubilees, if I've sold my property and then I have some good fortune financially, you have to sell it back to me if I want to. What you want doesn't matter. The land stays with the original owner as far as possible. Houses were treated a little bit differently. If a house was inside city walls and it was sold, it could be redeemed up to 1 year. After a year, it belonged to the buyer in perpetuity. If a house was out in the country, it fell under the Jubilee law. 50 years, it returns to the original owner. Now, Israelite slaves. If an Israelite had an Israelite slave, it wasn't someone who'd been taken in war and they weren't slaves forever. It's someone who'd sold themselves into slavery because of debt. Or maybe a child who'd been sold into slavery because of the parents' debts, okay? And Jewish slaves, if you had a Jewish slave, you were to treat them as hired workers, not slaves. It's still not a high social class, but it's a lot better than being a slave. And at the Jubilee, every 50 years, all the Israelite slaves go free. Now, you put that system together, and here's what's going on. God is trying to ensure that there is no permanent poverty. I mean, I don't care how foolish your grandpa was, or your daddy, maybe. You get the chance to start over. Because on Jubilee, it all comes home. You get to go home and start over. You've got property, you've got a house maybe, you've got fields where you can plant crops. You have a chance to make it and not be poor. There should, in theory, have been no poor people in Israel because of the law of debt and the law of Jubilee. Now, I say in theory because we kind of have strong suspicion that they didn't actually do that, okay? Which, given human beings, that's kind of understandable. But I want you to notice something. You realize that the system God put in place here, the needs of the poor define the property rights of landowners. The needs of the poor came before the rights of the fellow that bought the property. If that's what God expected of Israel, can we expect less from him? Think about it. What do we need? Grace, mercy, forgiveness. What are God's rights, let me put it that way? Well, given his power, his rights are anything he wants. But he has chosen to limit his rights. Why? Because of what we need. We need grace, mercy, and forgiveness. And so God has put in place a system that gives us grace, mercy, and forgiveness at tremendous cost to himself, no concern with what his rights were. All he saw was what we needed. And that's what he gave us. The last line is, lead us not into temptation. There are a lot of ancient Jewish prayers with similar lines, and you look at enough of those, and you come up with the conclusion that what this means is, let us not sin when we are tested. Because James 1 tells us that God does not tempt anyone. So lead us not into temptation. It's not that we're begging God, don't make me sin. God doesn't do that. What we're saying is, don't let me sin when I come into temptation, because let's face it, you're going to face temptation, aren't you? It's not a question of if, it's how many times a day. So please let me not sin when I come to temptation. All right, have we heard the first bell yet? Oh, well then we have time to play with language a little bit. All right, I love this kind of stuff. Let's look at the word Beelzebul for just a second. Now, the scribes and rabbis would actually change the names of people if those names involved a pagan god. 2 examples, and there are multiple in the Bible, but here are 2. Saul had a son that he named Eshbaal, which means man of Baal. That's 1 Chronicles 8:33. In 2 Samuel chapters 2 through 4, we see this guy quite a bit, and his name is Ishbosheth. Now here's what's going on. Hebrew was written without vowels. So the I-ish and the E-esh, that's the same. The vowels are the same. It's just the consonants are the same, and they're what counts. When the vowels were added later in Chronicles, they added an E, and in Samuel, they added an I. It's the same fella. So Ish-esh, Baal, man of Baal. Then he becomes Ishbosheth. Bosheth is the Hebrew word for shame. So in 2 Samuel, he's called man of shame, because the scribes didn't want to read man of Baal in God's holy book. Okay? Now, I guarantee you that Ishbosheth's mama did not name him man of shame. His daddy wouldn't have done that either. His name was Man of Baal, but it got changed to Ishbosheth. All right, another fellow, Merib-Baal, which means hero of Baal. 1 Chronicles 8, verse 34. This becomes Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel 4, verse 4, which something of shame. The Merib and the Mephib, how that came about, that's more Hebrew than I want to get into. But you have a Baal name that gets changed to shame. Same thing going on here. Now let's talk about Beelzebul and Baal-zebub. Way back in the Old Testament, remember the Philistines, right? They had 5 major cities. One of the cities was Ekron. The god of Ekron was called Baal-zebul. Yeah, there's an L at the end. Baal-zebul. Baal means Lord. Zebul means high place, perhaps heavenly place. So Baal-zebul, Lord of the heavenly place. Well, that's a nice name for a god, I suppose. The Israelites figured out that if you changed one letter, Baal-zebul, and made it Baal-zebub, you know what that means? Lord of the flies. Lord of the flies. So in 2 Kings chapter 1, the god of Ekron becomes Baal-zebub, the Lord of the flies. The Israelites loved word games like that. And to make an insult and a dig at a Philistine god was just better, you know. So they changed it to Baal-zebub. Now, centuries go by, and we get to the New Testament. And in Greek, here in Luke, you have Beelzebul. Well, that means in Greek, Lord of the heavenly place. So it's a return to the original name of that god, right? Okay. But what's happened is, in all the centuries between the Old and New Testaments, Beelzebub, Baal-zebul, whatever version of that you want, that name gets attached to the arch enemy of God. So I don't care what version of the name you use, who are you talking about? Satan, the devil. So when the Jews say that Jesus is casting out demons by Beelzebul, what they're saying is he's casting out demons by Satan. Which is why Jesus then points out that that makes no sense. Because demons are Satan's henchmen, right? Why in the world would Satan be kicking out his own henchmen? That just doesn't compute. But that's where all this came from. Baal-zebul becomes Baal-zebub, which becomes, wandering into Greek, and it winds up Beelzebul. But it's the arch enemy of God. Now, one other little thing. Can't tell you this is 100% true, but it's the kind of thing where you kind of wish it was true. We know that after the time of the New Testament, Zebul in Hebrew came to mean dung or manure. So Beelzebul might have meant what? Lord of the dung heap. Which, by the way, is where you would find flies, right? See how that all holds together? Anyway, that's all we've got for this morning. I appreciate your attention. I started a couple minutes early, so I'll let you go a couple minutes early. Thank you.